excited to do this. I've been wanting to do this for a long time, as you know. We're going to go all the way through the book of Revelation, verse by verse. This is a preterist view of Revelation. So this is predominantly what we're going to be going through, is a preterist view. I will go over the other views, and you'll see after today what those are. First off, I've been spending, many of you know, the last 3 or 4 years, about a couple thousand hours a year working on the book of Revelation. So I'm not just starting this. I've been working hard on it. And the more I've learned about it, the more astonishing the book has become to me. It has really blown my mind. It is by far the most incredible book ever written, hands down, of any book that's ever been written by anyone or a team of people. The more you study it, the more you realize this had to have been God that wrote this book, and that it's coming directly from God. First is these allusions. Now, an allusion isn't like an illusion, like a magic act. It's more like to allude to something, an implied reference. So it's not a direct quote from the Old Testament, but these are all allusions to the Old Testament. So like Isaiah, there's 79 allusions. Daniel 53, Ezekiel 48. Some people would say 84, that there's 84 allusions in Ezekiel. There's a difference in opinion on these. You know, some people put more, some people put less. Right here I've got listed over 300. There's also allusions to the New Testament. So these are something like, let's say like there's something that sounds very much like the Exodus. You know, all the things happening in the Exodus, you know, when Moses left Egypt. So that would be an allusion to it. So if something in the book of Revelation sounds like that, or it's applying that type of reference, then that would be an allusion to it. And you're going to see a lot of them. There's many other things that's going to really, the more deeper you get into the book of Revelation, the more it's going to just really open up your mind to the whole Bible, how you can see the Bible, how you see the prophets, how you see the major prophets, how you see the minor prophets. So all those things are going to start coming into play, and we're going to have a lot of verses that we're going to go to show all these things as they go. But it's the most remarkable book ever written, period, hands down. And a lot of people, the more they dive into it, the more stuff you find. And I won't be able to do it much justice, but we're going to just go as much as we can, because you know it could be ridiculous to spend so much time you won't ever get it done. This is D.L. Moody. He says, "I never saw a useful Christian who was not a student of the Bible." And to me, when you really take the Bible seriously, you have to take the book of Revelation, because Revelation is like the exclamation point. It's the final thing said in the Bible, and it's really important. So let's start right at verse 1, which is all we're going to do today. The revelation of St. John the Divine. This is in the King James. I'm going to be using the King James. I'm not a King James only, but I believe it's the book that God wants me to use, so that's the one I use. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. And he sent and signified it by his angel unto his servant John. See, there is some speculation of this John, that this may not be John the Apostle. We're going to go over that. And you see that the name is the name of the book. There's a lot of people that have a problem with that too. But the reason why they named it this way is to tell you who the author is. And that's what the King James does over and over. So they're saying the revelation of St. John the Divine. So they're telling you who the author is. But there's some people that have a problem with this because they think it should be named the revelation of Jesus Christ. Because that is what it is. It's the revelation of Jesus Christ, which means it's revealing what Jesus Christ to us. It's showing Jesus Christ to us. But the King James just puts that in there of St. John the Divine so you know who the author, who wrote it. Because if it isn't written by John the Apostle, we don't want it in our Bible. And if you notice, if you're reading the King James, many of the books, they put the author in the name of the book, in the title. Like in Genesis, it'll say the book of Moses called Genesis or something like that. So they're trying to tell you, especially as a new reader of the Bible, who the author is. But we need to know for sure who the author is. So we're going to go through that today. Who is the author? And there, like I said, there's some people who believe it's somebody else other than John the Apostle, but they're not really credible. And we're going to show that today, why they're not credible. So there's various titles of a lot of the other versions. I'll go through them. New King James says the revelation of Jesus Christ. See, because they didn't like that title, they changed it. The NASB says the revelation to John. NIV just says revelation. The Catholic Bible says the apocalypse of St. John the Apostle, which I really like that one because it tells you it is the Apostle John. So it's actually giving you exactly who it is. Apocalypse is the word in the Greek for revelation. It just means unveiling, the unveiling. So it's showing you who Jesus Christ is. That's the whole point of the book of Revelation. And the Interlinear Bible, if you look at the oldest Greek, it says a revelation of John. But these are not inspired. The title is not inspired. Like I said, if you look at Genesis, that name comes actually from the Septuagint, which is just basically the Greek version of the Old Testament. The Hebrews originally didn't call Genesis Genesis. They called it in the beginning. So whatever it said at the beginning of each book, that's they named it. So they didn't really have a name for each book in the Bible. What they just called it the first few words in each book. But then later people started naming all the books. So we end up with all these names on the books. And so, like I said, this isn't inspired, the name. But to me, I think it's fine for them to tell us who wrote it. You know, the scholars to tell us that. Especially for someone who's new to reading the Bible. They want to know who wrote it. The authorship that was by John the Apostle, these are all early Christians. You see Irenaeus, some say Irenaeus, I say Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Tertullian, Clement, all affirm that John, the Apostle John, was the author of Revelation. This is, to me, all I need. It's this one right here. This is what's called Apostolic Succession. So we know Irenaeus said that John was the writer. And he wrote a book. I have it right here. Against Heresies. About 500 pages long. If you want to read it, it's a good book. But anyways, he wrote in his book, over and over, he refers to the book of Revelation and that it was written by the Apostle John. Well, his teacher was Polycarp. And then Polycarp's teacher was the Apostle John. So to me, that is enough evidence for me. There's a lot more evidence out there if you want it, but for me, that's enough evidence. I don't need any more than that. I mean, if you want to, there's a lot of things you could go and knock your lights out, learning who the author is of Revelation. But to me, this is enough. I don't need any more than that. Hopefully that's understandable to you. Can you kind of see that? So you see the time periods and everything there. So when was Revelation written? This is very important to the view that we're talking about now. It's not so much important to the other views, but to the view that I'm presenting, Preterist View, it is very important, and you'll see why as we get there. But it's important anyways, because let's say if Revelation was written in 200 AD, then it for sure wasn't written by the Apostle John. So we still need to know when it was written to make sure that it's written by somebody who is an apostle, or we don't want it in the Bible. So there's two types of evidence for when it was written. And one is external evidence, and the other one's internal evidence. External evidence would be like a book like this. It's not in the Bible. Internal evidence would be in the book of Revelation itself, or in the Bible. And let's start off with the external evidence. The first one I'm going to talk about, once again, is this guy I got right here, Irenaeus. He wrote in this book, there's something in there, and I'm going to read it to you right now. And many people believe that this gives it the later date, because there's two dates that are in question. Anyways, this is what he wrote in his book. That's on page 495. He says, well, let me set this up a little bit. The whole point of this, what he's talking about, is who is Antichrist. Who is the name of Antichrist? And he goes on for chapter, a few pages. And then finally gets to this statement. And he says, "We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of Antichrist. For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who held the apocalyptic vision. For that was seen no very long time since, but almost in our day, towards the end of Domitian's reign." Now, Domitian's reign was from 81 to 96. So the question here is, and if you read Irenaeus, you know he's kind of, the way he writes, it's a little hard to follow. And from what I understand, all the study I've done from the Greek, that there's a big question of who is he talking about here. Is he talking about when the Antichrist would have been revealed, or when was the vision held? Or in other words, when did John have the vision? So that's a big question. See, so you see I have it in the name of God. For if it, so where it's in the middle there, it says, it would have been announced by him who held the apocalyptic vision. What's it? And it says, for that was seen no very long time since. What was the that? That's the big question. What is the that? Is that the apocalyptic vision, or when they would have seen John, and when John would have been telling them, you know, who Antichrist was? So that's a big question there. So many now, because most people are premillennial dispensationalists, they would say that they believe that it was in 95 that Revelation was written, or that the vision was held in 95. Me, after reading Irenaeus, and the way I see this, if you read this in context, to me, I think he's talking about the name of Antichrist would have been revealed. So you can read this and come to your own conclusion, but that's the way I take that. And to me, there's a lot of time people have spent going over just this big long sentence here. And I'll show you some more stuff that'll give you a bit. But see, the very key to it is, for that was seen no very long time since. What was that? Many people believe that Irenaeus is talking about the apocalyptic vision. But like I said, I believe he's talking about when John would have revealed Antichrist, the name of Antichrist. The other part of this external evidence, which is this external evidence, is Irenaeus actually says in his book that Jesus was 50 years old, not 33 years old. So we know that Irenaeus doesn't always get things right, because for sure Jesus was not 50 years old. Irenaeus thought Jesus had a 15 to 20 year ministry. So we don't want to put too much faith in Irenaeus anyways. So even if that is what he meant, which I don't think that's what he meant, it's still external, and he gets other things wrong, so you can't really trust him on all of his numbers and what maybe he would say that happened. The other thing is he says a couple pages prior to that, in this whole context, he says, he's talking about the book of Revelation, he says the most approved and ancient copies of the apocalypse. Well, that seems almost opposite. So if something wasn't seen very long time since, remember in the last slide, he said he didn't see that very long time ago. Well, that wouldn't make sense if he's talking about ancient copies of the Revelation, because it would make more sense if Revelation was written 30 years prior to call it ancient. The early date would be 65, the later date would be 95. That would be the date of writing. So that's what I'm talking about, the 30 years. Clement of Alexandria is another whose external evidence, this is what he says in his book. After the death of the tyrant, he removed from the island of Patmos to Ephesus. Now, most scholars believe that the tyrant is Nero. That's what they called Nero, was the tyrant. So Nero would have put it, this is saying that it would be the early date. So if John was removed from the island after the tyrant, after the death of the tyrant, he moved from the island, it wouldn't make sense if it was in Domitian's reign. Now, see, because Domitian's reign, it would have been in 95. Nero would have been in 65. So see that? The other thing he's talking about is in Clement of Alexandria, he has a story where he's talking about John on horseback, and he's chasing a bandit who was a lapsed Christian. So if John was almost 100 years old doing that, and it's very athletic, the way he's talking about it and everything, he's chasing this guy down, it would be very unlikely. People at 95 back then or 100 years old back then, they're not as healthy as even a 100-year-old today. And to be doing the things that they said he did is very unlikely. So these are a few of the evidences that show for the earlier date. This all centers around the siege of Jerusalem. The siege of Jerusalem happened in 70 AD. This is like one of the most concrete numbers we know in the ancient world. Like we really know the birth of Jesus, the date of that, and the death of Jesus. We know those dates really well. Those are rock solid dates. Well, 70 AD, when the siege of Jerusalem, when Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed, it's very well documented. It's 70 AD. And you're going to hear that a lot as we go through this because that's a really important date. So as we go through this, you're going to hear that date over and over. You see down there I have a link, but if you go to YouTube, you can just type in the siege of Jerusalem and you can watch this whole thing that these people put together. I'm going to play a little bit of it. Hopefully we can hear it.
The siege of Jerusalem was a massive military endeavor the likes of which had not been seen since the fall of Carthage 2 centuries earlier. Starting in April of 70 AD and lasting nearly 5 months, the battle would be a brutal, no-holds-barred brawl fought over every inch of the city. At stake was the success of the Great Revolt in Judea and the survival of the Jewish people.
Well, we're not going to watch that whole thing because it's 45 minutes, but it gives you an idea, and what it does is it goes through the whole siege of Jerusalem. It doesn't give all the details, but it gives some, and it gives you at least an idea of it. So the Olivet Discourse, this is a teaser on the Olivet Discourse. Eventually we're going to go through it, but I'm just going to show you a few verses because this is important to the 70 AD and the temple. See, right now we're looking here at the temple. This would be a model of the temple based on a lot of the books that we have. And anyways, the Olivet Discourse is Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. This is in Mark 13. I'm going to read this. And as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said unto him, Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here? And Jesus answering said unto him, Seest thou these great buildings? There shall not be one stone left upon another that shall not be thrown down. And they're all telling him, look at these awesome buildings. Look at how magnificent these are. And then Jesus hits him with a whopper. And he says, all these will be completely destroyed. And then they come to him privately. It says, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives over against the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled? So very clearly they're asking here, what's going to be the sign of these buildings being destroyed? And when is it going to happen? So they ask him 2 questions. What's going to be the sign of it happening? And when is it going to happen? Then you go all the way through the Olivet Discourse. And then at the very end of it, or almost at the end of it, he says, Verily I say unto you, that this generation shall not pass till all these things be done. So he gives them all the signs of what's going to happen. Then he tells them the when at the very end. He's saying, this generation shall not pass till all these things be done. Now, some people will try to say that the generation is all Jews for all time, but that's never used in Scripture that way. It's never used. It always means the current generation. This is an amazing prophecy of Jesus, and that's why I want to bring it up, because this was probably somewhere around 30 to 33 AD, and a generation to the Jews is always 40 years. It's that's how long Moses had them in the wilderness, 40 years. The generation had to be gone before they went into the promised land. Jesus spent 40 days, 40 nights. 40 is a really important day. So did Moses. He spent 40 days, 40 nights fasting. Where he's on Mount Sinai. So all those things, but 40 years is always considered a generation. And so this prophecy was fulfilled perfectly, because that's exactly, if it was 33, that's within the 40 years. So right within what Jesus said, it was held. This is an amazing prophecy that was fulfilled, and I just wanted to point it out. And this is what a lot of it hinges on, and the parallels to that to the book of Revelation. And we'll get into that as we go. Josephus is another part of the external evidence, and he has a book here, another book you can look at, and it's called Works of Josephus. You can't see anything there, but it's about 700 pages long, something like that, so you can read that. It's a lot of fun. But there's two parts of it. The first is the antiquities of the Jews, and the second part is the War of the Jews. And the War of the Jews is all about 70 AD, and he talks all about the destruction of the temple and all the things that happened. So that's another bit of external evidence that helps us to point towards things happening in the book of Revelation. And we'll go over that. He lived through the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. He lived from 37 to 100 AD. And he was a historian, and he documents it all. So it's an amazing thing that we have this book. We have very few ancient books, but this is one of the ancient books that comes down from, of old, that was preserved. So it's really amazing, and there's a lot of things that he says that fits so perfectly into the book of Revelation, and you'll see as we do it. He was not a Christian. He was a Jew, so he would have never read Revelation. So the amazing similarities are, you can see that the way the book of Revelation was written, that it parallels the things that he said. So now the internal evidence, which I think is the most compelling for the early date. First of all, once again, we're looking at the Herod's temple. If you notice the Gentiles' courtyard on the outside, the women's courtyard, the priest's courtyard. So we're just to get a little bit of idea of what the temple looked like and what the names of these things are. Revelation 11:1 says, "And there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not. For it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. So he's told here in this vision, when we get into Revelation, we're going to talk more about chapter 11, but he's told to go out and measure the temple. Well, it would have been nonsensical to say to go measure the temple when the temple's been destroyed in 70 AD. If this was written in 95, the later date, it would make no sense to somebody to say, okay, go measure the temple. What temple? See, now what a lot of people will try to say is that this is some later built temple. But I say it says the temple of God. I don't believe that there can be a new temple built or a new temple that's of God. You could build a new temple, but it's not of God. That was the last temple that you could measure is a real temple, that is a temple of God. So that's my contention with this, and I'm going to go through some more to show you that. But this is one of the internal evidences that would make you think of the earlier date. It would be like us saying, go measure the Twin Towers. They were destroyed 20 years ago. It'd be silly. Go measure the Twin Towers. Well, yeah, they were destroyed 20 years ago. It's the same for them. If it was destroyed in 70 AD and it's 95 AD, they were destroyed 25 years ago. They said, what are you talking about, John? Why are you talking about measuring a temple? It's been destroyed 25 years ago. So it's the same idea, which makes it seem more likely that it was written in 65. So the internal evidence shows that. Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. What is he talking about? He's not talking about a physical temple, right? He's talking about a spiritual temple, the temple in us. You are the temple of God. Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy. For the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are. That's the only temple that can ever be ever again that's a temple of God, is the one that's in us. This, I want to drive this point home because this is a contention to me, and as the more I study, the more of a problem it is. Paul's talking about another gospel. He says, "But though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. As we said before, so I say now again, if any man preach any other gospel unto you than that ye have received, let him be accursed." So if anyone preaches another gospel, what do you think Paul thinks of that? He's basically saying, let him be accursed. What's the gospel? That Jesus Christ died on the cross for our sins, right? That's the gospel. The whole gospel is that Jesus Christ died on the cross for our sins. See, this is the basis of premillennial dispensationalism. I know I'm using big words that maybe I haven't explained yet. Hopefully you'll know what this is. Premillennial dispensationalism is the most common view out there going right now. It's almost all Christians, or Protestants at least, believe in premillennial dispensationalism. It's actually forced on some churches. You can't be a pastor of that church, matter of fact, the church we go to, unless you believe premillennial dispensationalism. Well, this was written by Clarence Larkin, or drawn by this drawing here. You see him up there. He did this about 1917, something like that, 1916. He did all these drawings. He made this big book here, and it's filled with all these beautiful drawings. I mean, you're just filled with them. And he did all these charts and everything. It's really beautiful. And the name of this book is The Greatest Book in the World on Dispensational Truth. And he basically says he's inspired. Basically what he says is that these drawings are inspired. Well, what this is all about, this drawing here, is about the covenants. So a covenant is a promise to God, right? So he has all these covenants and all these arrows going all which way directions, right? Well, about 5 years ago, I redrew it. And it's identical to his. I drew it so I could see it better and everything. But now I've realized when you get right down to it, all these covenants, there's only one of these covenants that has to do with your salvation. You look at all these other Edenic covenant, Adamic covenant, the Davidic covenant, all these different covenants they throw through there. But what makes you righteous was always the same. And that's Jesus. Jesus dying on the cross is always what made a sinner righteous. And you see here, when I got rid of all the minutia, because see all that stuff, it just confuses you. This is the bottom line with premillennial dispensationalism. They call these dispensations. Each one of these little bubbles is a dispensation. Dispensation just means how it's administered. So what the main point I'm trying to bring here is, what makes you righteous before God? How do you get your salvation? And see, they have a little end run around here around Jesus. And this is what I want to point out, is this end run around Jesus. They're saying what they call the tribulation saints are going to have this other way, other than Jesus. They're going to build a new temple. They're going to build a whole new temple, and they're going to start sacrificing animals, and that's how they're going to atone for their sins during the tribulation. This is the whole belief of premillennial dispensationalism, that there's another way other than Jesus, another gospel. And to me, this is heretical. This is heretical, so that's why I want to point it out. No one will go to the carpet on this because everybody's afraid of them, because there's a whole bunch of them. And they jump you if you say this. They will go after you. But that's what they believe. But they'll say, oh, well, now we don't say that. In other words, they'll say, well, now we believe that you have to, go through Jesus to be saved. But in the tribulation, they have this new way, this little end run around Jesus. Jesus, the covenant of Christ is an everlasting covenant. There's no other way. It's the only way ever. It's the only ever way there was. Abraham looked forward to see Jesus' day. All these, see now we're no longer under the law, the Moses law. That was done away with. You see the law there of Moses. That was what they called the legal dispensation. See, they have all these different ways, that they said that God made someone righteous. But there's really none of those really have anything to do with it. It's always been your heart. Heart what made people right. If they were Jewish, didn't matter. Moses, look at all the people who were killed by God with Moses. They were sacrificing idols and stuff. They were Jewish. Didn't matter. They were Israelites. Didn't matter. They still died because of the heart. So the heart's always what it was that makes you right. And I wanted to show this because this is what it all comes down to. In his little chart, they kind of sneak it in because they have a bunch of arrows going everywhere, which way. But really, this is a different way of getting salvation. Hebrews 10, it very clearly says, a sacrifice and offering and burnt offerings and offering for sin thou wouldst not, neither hadst pleasure therein, which are offered by the law. Then said he, Lo, I come to do thy will, O God. He taketh away the first, that he may establish the second, by the which will we are sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Very clear in Hebrews, he's taking away the first, that's the law, that's Moses' law, to establish the second. There's no more law. There's not that little end run around. It's gone. It's been destroyed. God destroyed the temple. It was God that destroyed the temple in 70 AD. So you can see again that little end run around. That's what all this is about, is just to tell you that you can't have a newly rebuilt temple, this is what their contention is, that somebody's going to rebuild a temple of God. I say it can't be done. So that shows the internal evidence that, that it has to be, the temple of God has to be standing when John wrote it, or it only makes sense, or it doesn't make sense if it does. The last physical temple of God was destroyed in 70 AD. There will never be another temple of God as a physical building on earth. Here's some more internal evidence. This is in Revelation 17. And there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. But when he cometh, he must continue a short space. So these are the 7 Caesars. Remember when they said we have no king but Caesar? These are the kings. We call them Caesars, but they call them kings then. So there are 7 kings. Here they are, 7. 5 are fallen. 5 are fallen. That takes us to Claudius. Julius, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius. That's the 5 that are fallen. 1 is, that's Nero. Caesar Nero. So if he's saying, this is what he's writing in the book of Revelation. 1 is, it's Nero. That means Nero died in 68. He killed himself in 68. So we know that the book of Revelation, according to this, would have been written prior to 68 AD. So it's another bit of internal evidence that shows the early date of some 65. We're going to just assume it's 65. Then you can see that 1 must continue for a short space. That'd be Galba. He had less than a year. He was very short. Some will say that Julius shouldn't be considered, but that's really not right, because all the ancient people at that time would always consider Julius Caesar one of the Caesars. But even if they didn't, you still end up with Otho that only was in there for a short space, and that would put it still at an early date, but that would put it in Galba instead of Nero. But all the ancient writers, all the people like Irenaeus, stuff like that, they always considered Julius one of the Caesars, and the people before him even. So these are all scholars that hold to the pre-70 date, or the early date. You may have heard of some of them. These are all from the 17 and 1800s on the left. Adam Clark, F.F. Bruce, all them. Those are, then on the right are some more contemporary people you might have heard of. R.C. Sproul, J. Adams, they just both died recently. Then Gary DeMar, Bruce Gore, Kenneth Gentry, Doug Wilson, and last but not least, Steve Gregg. So all the guys on the right are all preterists, and they're all scholars, and many books and stuff they've written. And the guys on the left, most of them are preterists, but not all of them. But they all believe in the pre-70 date of the writing of Revelation. So if you want to really get more into this, Kenneth Gentry, he wrote his dissertation on it, and he has a book called Before Jerusalem Fell, and he gets really into it and shows how the early date, and his whole book of it on it if you want to get into that. So this is really what we were starting to talk about at the beginning, which I really wanted to get into, is the 4 views of Revelation. And this is, a lot of people don't know what this is, and I didn't either before. I really got deep into this. I didn't know what it was. Somebody said 4 views of Revelation. I said, what? Pre-trib rapture, mid-trib rapture, end-of-trib rapture? That's only 3. There's only 3 views. That's what are you talking about? Those are only 3 views. But those are all just one view. That's called the Futurist View. So the Futurist View believes that most of Revelation happens in the future. So most of the book of Revelation is for the future. Most all of it, not all of it, but most of it was written, it's about something in the future. The second view, and the Futurist View is most common. So that's those, like I said, the pre-trib rapture would be the Futurist View. The next one would be the Historicist View. Historicist view means it happened throughout history. And I'm going to go a little bit more into this in a second, but if you've ever studied the Pre-Millennial Dispensationalism, the most common view, they believe the churches in chapters 2 and 3 are also a representation of all of the church age. So you have the Ephesus age, the Smyrna age, all the way through all the different time periods throughout the 2,000 years of church history, and then now we're in the Laodicean age. So they would say that this is what we're, throughout history, those churches represent time periods. Well, they got that from the historicist view. They didn't come up with that. That was already an existing view. Some people call this the Protestant view because it became really popular around the time of Martin Luther and all them around the 1517, and Calvin had that view. But it has the day-year theory in it. And we'll go over that more later, but they believe that the days represent a year, and it would predict so that they could figure out when the last day was going to be, when the rapture was going to happen, all that. The Millerites were part of that. So there's a lot of people that were part of it. The only people that have this view now that I know of is Seventh-day Adventists. And Seventh-day Adventists still hold to this view, the historicist view. It's a little bit different than the one that Martin Luther had, but it's similar. The third one is the Preterist view, and that's the one we're going to be going over. And a Preterist view, Preterist just means past. So that means that most of Revelation happened in the past. So the Preterist view being the opposite of the Futurist, so that's in the future, would be the opposite, the past. And then the last view is the Idealist view. And that means something like ideally, or you say idealist, but it means what happens symbolically. So they believe that everything in the book of Revelation is symbolic. And you'll see as we get more through this, I'm going to dial them all in here today, hopefully, so you have a really good idea of all these. But so Idealist view is, let's say that each thing has a symbol, almost everything in it. And similar to the historicist where they put it in categories. And I'll get into that later as we go through it too. Because I actually hold to 3 of these views. I hold to the Futurist view in certain areas. I hold to the Preterist view in certain areas, or most of it, and then Idealist in certain areas. And I'll point those out to you as I go. So this is just to show you those churches again. This is another one by Clarence Larkin, a drawing, and you could kind of see that each age, I don't know if you can read this, the text is so small, but Ephesus age, all the different ages of the church. And see, that would put us in the Laodicean age now as it went through the 2,000 years. And they still use these, people still do this. And in the most common view does this. So it's been around since 1830 is when Pre-Millennial Dispensationalism started basically. We're going to get more to that in a second too. So you have these 4 views of Revelation. And I want to show you that these are opposed to the other 3 views that you've heard of, and those are the 3 millennial views. So some people think that's a view of Revelation, but it's not. So when you hear pre-millennial, like I've been using that already a lot, pre-millennial, post-millennial, and amillennial. Pre meaning before the millennium, post meaning after the millennium, and amillennial means no millennium. Basically, that's what the word means. But I want to get more into dialing these in so you have a really good understanding of these 3 views. First is a premillennial view. Premillennial means that's when Christ is going to return. Christ is returning before the millennium. The millennium is 1,000 years. So the 1,000-year reign, it would be called the millennium. That's what they call it. It's because that's what millennium means. So pre-millennial means Christ returns before the millennium. So if you see there where Satan is bound, I wanted to point that out, but they say Christ returns when Satan is bound. At the beginning of chapter 20, it talks about Satan being bound. Then you get 1,000 years, and then the last day or judgment day. Most believe in a physical 1,000 years, literal, exactly 1,000 years, not 1,001, 1,000-year millennium. Christ returns, start the clock, 1,000 years, and then they live. But Christ comes down to earth, and all the people in their glorified bodies are on earth, but we're with all these physical people on earth, and we're ruling and reigning over them. So you have people who are in glorified bodies, can't be killed, with people who are just regular humans living for 1,000 years with Christ here on earth. But then yet, at the end of it, they believe that there's going to be an uprising, and that Satan's going to be released, and all these people are going to deny Christ, and that there's going to be surround the saints. That's what it says in chapter 20. So it seems like the least likely view, but it's the most held view. And the reason why I say it seems the least likely is because that means Jesus failed. If Jesus came down here to earth and he's setting up a reign here on earth, he can't succeed. He fails. Because at the end, Satan, most of the people are going to rebel. The other thing that seems silly about it is when you really think about it, you're going to have people in regular humans that could stab you and you can't kill me. They're just walking around together. And Christ, you can look at him. Why would somebody deny Christ? They look right at him, seeing supernatural. The other thing is, if this could be done, why didn't God do it 6,000 years ago? At least 2,000 years ago he could have did it. Why didn't he come back 2,000 years ago? If you can get people saved with him being here on earth, or at this, you still have free will, why didn't he do 2,000 years ago? Makes no sense to me. But this is the view that they hold, and the literal 1,000 years. As a child, I have to tell you these stories because as a child I thought about these things. I watched a guy with the big chart, he had the big charts, and he went through all the views. And then you get Christ comes down to earth, and he's ruling and reigning. And then all of a sudden, they release Satan. They got him bound. Why would you release Satan? He's here on earth. Christ is with all us, the saints, here on earth in our glorified bodies, not being able to kill, impenetrable. But yet he's going to release Satan? It made absolutely no sense to me. And it makes absolutely no sense to me now either. But the blinders were on for a long time. And I just put it in, even though it didn't make sense to me, I threw it in the back because what else could be right? This is what everybody believes. They know more than me. I never studied it, The next one is post-millennial. Christ returns after the millennium. So post-millennium. So here Christ returned before the millennium. Here Christ returns after the millennium. So post-millennial believe that you're going to have a long period of time. They have this really optimistic view about the Christians, that we're going to win over the whole world, and everyone in the world is going to become a Christian. That's what post-millennials believe. They believe that everyone in the world is going to become Christian, and then 1,000 years before Christ comes back, that's when it happens. So exactly 1,000 years before Christ returns, everyone in the whole world will be Christian. So it's a very optimistic view, and they take this by just a few verses. One of them is every knee shall bow, and they have some other verses, and I'll get to that when we get to them. And they have good verses. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they have no leg to stand on, but that's what they believe is. It's eventually Satan will be bound 1,000 years. Then after the millennium, post-millennial, Christ returns. So that's post-millennial view. The last one is amillennial view, which a lot of us amillennials like to be called the realized millennium, because amillennial would tell you that there's no millennium. What we would really like to say is we realize that the millennium started back when Christ was on earth. So we believe that the millennium, or the 1,000 years, is a figurative number. It's not an exact number. Like almost all the numbers in Revelation are figurative. So we believe Satan was bound when Christ was here on earth. And we have scripture for that. And the main scripture we have is when Christ was casting out demons. And they said, how do you cast out these demons? He goes, unless you bind the strong man, you cannot go into his house and plunder it. So he's binding the strong man. The strong man is Satan. So that would happen 2,000 years ago when Christ was here. He bound the strong man. There's a lot of other verses for binding the strong man. I'm not going to get into them now. But basically, so there's this long period of time, and then Satan is released. At the little season, right before the last day, Satan is released. So Satan's been bound for these thousands of years, right? Say it goes another 3,000 years, who knows, whatever. But at the very last, there's going to be a short season where Satan is released. Now you go, what? See now, because I don't want to be saying, oh, well, all this bad about them thinking that Satan's been released and say, oh, I don't have a reason for you. Well, if everything gets really bad, it would make sense for Satan to be released to end the suffering, to make it all just end. And then God comes in and just takes him out. That to me makes sense. So as things get worse and worse, at a certain point, God wants to end the suffering. He doesn't want it to drag out. So at the very end, he releases Satan to make it really bad, so he just comes in and takes him out. But he's going to come to rescue. And it says this in chapter 20. All of this only exists in chapter 20 of Revelation. Nowhere else in the Bible. It's the only place that it talks about the millennium. Now, some post-millennials believe almost identical to the amillennial. So in other words, they don't believe that there's any 1,000 year at the end. They believe that Satan was bound at, like I showed there, at the cross, just like the amillennial. So essentially, their view is identical, post-millennial to amillennial, except one thing. The post-millennial is optimistic, and the amillennial is pessimistic. So amillennial thinks things are going to get worse. The post-millennial thinks it's going to get better. So even though they both take it like a symbolic period, a big long period, the only difference is the post-millennial believe everything's going to get really good as towards the end. So they still take the whole church age as the millennium. In other words, they don't believe Satan's bound here, it's over there. They're identical. The only difference is one is positive, the other one's negative. So it's and they have verses, and I'll get into that when we get to chapter 20. But I wanted you to get these ideas because as we go through, all these things come up and how they fit together. So if you have a better idea of these, you'll be able to see how this fits to the four views and how those fit together. And so you have these four views: the Futurist view, Historicist view, the Preterist view, and the Idealist views. Then you have these three millennial views: the Pre-Millennial View, the Post-Millennial View, and the Amillennial View. Now, any one of these four views can hold any one of these three. So in other words, you can be a futurist, which is a premillennial. That's what they are. The most common view is Pre-Millennial Dispensationalism, which is a futurist view. They believe most of the book of Revelation is still about the future, but they believe premillennial, like that first view we saw. The literal 1,000 years, Christ returns premillennial, before the millennium. Next one, historicist, they could take any one of those three views too. And actually futurists, I know that some futurists are amillennial. So I know some that are. I don't know any futurists that are postmillennial, but I'm sure there are some. Preterist, same thing. It could be any one of those. Most preterists are either postmillennial or amillennial. I don't know of any preterists that are premillennial, but could be. Idealist, it would be very unlikely that an idealist, they're taking everything symbolically to take the 1,000 years literal. They could be premillennial but just not take the 1,000 years literal, because they're taking everything symbolic. It'd be weird. You go all the way through the book, taking everything symbolic, and then all of a sudden you get to chapter 20 and you take it literal. It'd be very unlikely. So these are the history of the millennial views, and I'm just going to go through them real quick. In the 100s to 200s, it was almost all those writers there, including Irenaeus, Polycarp, Justin Martyr, were premillennial. From the 200s to the 1700s, that was almost all amillennial. So it was predominant. You see some of the people there, Luther, Calvin, Augustine, Eusebius, Origen. Then from the 1700s to the 1900s was post-millennialism. And then since 1830, Pre-Millennial Dispensationalism has taken over for the most part, so we're mostly premillennial. And this is all considering, all these things are considering only one facet of some of the church, especially the D there and the present, that's only considering the Protestants in the West. Because if you look at, like Eastern Orthodox or some of them, they have completely different views than what we have. So we're looking at all this from our point of view. And Catholics don't hold to this. And there's way more Catholics than there are Protestants. So this isn't, so even though it's just generalization is what I'm getting at with all these. So was the early church uniformly premillennial? Now we see that the writers were mostly. But here's what Justin Martyr said. He said, regarding the hope of the millennial kingdom, admitted to you formally that I and many others are of this opinion and believe that such will take place, as you assuredly are aware of. But on the other hand, I signified to you that many who belong to the pure and pious faith and are true Christians think otherwise. So he's saying even though he's premillennial, there's a lot of Christians that are otherwise. There's other Christians out there that are other than that. So we don't know that they all were. And then Irenaeus also is another one in Against Heresies. In that book, he said some who are reckoned among the Orthodox who do not hold to the premillennial views. So I just want to point that out real quick, even though I'm showing you all this history of the millennial views. This is just the millennial views. This isn't the other four views. Because there's a lot of, they're all over the place on that too. So the summary real quick. I want you to fall in love with Revelation. The authorship is the Apostle John. We're going to always assume that, and it's very clear to me. The date of writing, we're going to take the 65 AD date. And as I go through this, so it's pre-70. No new temple of God. There cannot be a new temple of God. That's impossible. The four views, hopefully you all got a good idea of those four views. The three millennial views also. And we must understand chapter 1 in order to understand the rest of Revelation. So I'm going to spend a lot of time on chapter 1. The next one is going to be on the instructions. So they're really important. And that's about it. So if anybody has any questions, hopefully that you have a better idea of some of these things like the four views and also the millennial views.